Hello and welcome. My name is David Brooks. I am a writer with the Concord Monitor and moderator of Science Cafe for this starting our 7th year. So here's how it works. We have our esteemed panelists who have frantically finished eating, and I will, once I give you a quick intro, I will introduce them, ask a question, and after that, it's up to you guys to ask questions, and if you don't ask anything, it's really boring, so make sure you ask stuff. Our topic tonight, as you know, is biodiversity in general and specific, and we have two panelists. The third panelist actually couldn't make it at the last minute, a personal family thing. So we have Pam Hunt, who is with the New Hampshire Audubon, and Pete Bowman, who's with the New Hampshire Natural Heritage Bureau. That is correct. And you're also a biologist, right? Yeah, okay. Excellent. And as I said, your questions will drive it. And I get to ask first question because I have the first microphone. So I will start asking you guys to actually give us about 2 minutes discussing your, well, as I say, why we should pay any attention to you. So basically, you know, what you know and why we should listen to you. So you've got the microphones. Why don't you start?
My name is Pete Bowman. I'm a wildlife specialist with the New Hampshire Natural Heritage Bureau. It's a state agency. It's part of Department of Resources and Economic Development and Division of Forests and Lands. And it is the office that's responsible for maintaining the database on rare plant and animal species throughout New Hampshire, as well as exemplary natural communities, which is a way of thinking about wildlife habitats. And I maintain the database for rare wildlife species, as well as conduct surveys for rare plant species and natural communities.
Pam Hunt. I'm with New Hampshire Audubon. And New Hampshire Audubon is a statewide organization. Our mission is to protect New Hampshire's natural environment for wildlife and for people. We do 4 things. We do education, we do wildlife conservation science, we do advocacy, and we do land protection. And if you're not a member, you should be, so you can come talk to me afterwards. And I'm an avian conservation biologist. My work is mostly done in bird conservation. I also work in dragonflies. And ironically enough, when I first started working at Audubon, I was hired to coordinate a biodiversity project. So it's all come full circle.
You can run, but you can't hide. Excellent. All right. As I said, I'll ask the first question. When you all want to ask a question, it's just like school. You got to raise your hand, and either Steve Leone of the Monitor or I will come around with a microphone. Please wait for the microphone. Partly so other people can hear you, but also so the television can hear it. So, okay, so I'll start. First question for you, which is sort of the 30,000-foot question is, you know, what is biodiversity aside from a nice sounding buzzword?
Well, biodiversity, very simply, is basically all the living things, plants and animals of all different types that live in a particular area. So you could talk about the biodiversity of New Hampshire, the biodiversity of your town, the biodiversity of the White Mountains, and that would encompass every living thing that is native to that environment or that place and all of their interactions with one another.
So you can have the biodiversity of this room.
You could.
A lot of yeast. All right. All right. That's it. It's up to you.
The Karner blue butterfly in the Concord Barrens. A couple of questions about that. First off, are they in fact really just located in that one section of East Concord, basically, in those pine barrens? And why is that? And how is the reclamation project for those fellas going?
Well, Karner blues are a little butterfly. They are federally listed as endangered. They were native to New Hampshire, and they occur pretty much exclusively in pine barren habitats, which are very restricted in New Hampshire. And they feed primarily on wild lupin, which is a rare plant, found mostly in pine barren habitats. Most of our pine barrens in Concord have been developed. The Concord Heights were the pine barrens. They were extirpated, meaning they disappeared from New Hampshire for many years because of loss of habitat. And then, I'm not sure when the restoration project started, 10, 15 years ago. They brought them in from populations in upstate New York, I believe, and basically began propagating them kind of in the lab to release out to the Concord Pine Barrens habitat. At the same time, they were propagating lupins, the primary feed plant, and planting those out. Most of that work has been at the Concord Airport and then the surrounding Pine Barrens habitat. And that is the only place they are extant in New Hampshire.
And there's actually only 2 places in the entire Northeast for them. They occur from the Midwest all the way to New Hampshire, but there's 1 site in New York and 1 site in New Hampshire. And those 2 sites actually work together to trade bugs back and forth to keep the genetic diversity a little better than it used to be.
And I believe that's the only spot I know of where we do controlled burning for wildlife. Is that right? Do you know? I mean, I know they do burning sometimes.
Our largest Pine Barrens habitat in the state is actually up in Ossipee area.
Oh, yeah?
And they do burn there to maintain that. The Nature Conservancy has a large preserve there that they work on. There's some state lands that they burn on. And there's been talk about introducing prescribed fire to more locations throughout the state to maintain fire-prone or at least somewhat fire-adapted natural communities.
So what makes biodiversity in New Hampshire distinct or unique compared to our neighbors in Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, and other Northeast states? What is special about New Hampshire?
Well, New Hampshire, unlike Vermont at least, we have coastline, so they don't have that. The biggest thing in New Hampshire, at least in terms of New England, is our alpine habitat. Other states, Maine and Vermont, also have some alpine habitat, but neither of them have nearly the extent that we do up in the presidential range, Mount Washington and the surrounding peaks. It's several square miles, and there's a huge number of plants that only occur in the alpine zone of the White Mountains within New Hampshire. A couple of them are globally rare. One of them occurs at one site up by Mount Monroe, and that's the only place in the world that it grows. And there are a couple of rare butterflies up there. There's a bird species that is the only place it nests in New Hampshire is in the alpine zone. So that's kind of the hot thing for biodiversity in New Hampshire as compared to surrounding states.
And I'll just throw in a science caveat that biodiversity doesn't really care what state it's in. And, so we kind of put our little state boxes around stuff, but the birds and plants and everything else still disperse across boundaries. And so from the perspective of critters, including plants, state lines are irrelevant. So you got to think about little bigger ecosystem pictures rather than state lines.
My question follows from a climate change conference I'm organizing in Star Island off Portsmouth. And so my question is, how does climate change, present and the future, affecting species diversity?
I can do that. Yes.
Next question.
Obviously, the effects of climate change on biodiversity are just as variable as the critters and plants that it affects. There are some species that will increase because they're adapted to warm climates. There are some that will decrease because they need wetter summers, which we haven't been having. And so every individual species in the whole ecosystem is going to respond differently to whatever piece of climate change it is, and it's not just temperature, obviously. And so when we try to think about effects of climate change on biodiversity, it's going to affect each individual organism separately, and the interactions between them are going to be different. And so it's really hard to predict what's going to happen as climate change progresses, because some plants are going to migrate north faster than others, some things are going to disappear entirely, some things are going to increase. Poison ivy is supposed to increase. Get ready for that. And so it's really, so the answer really is yes, because there's so many different pieces. If you think about 15 to 20,000 species of plants and animals in New Hampshire, each one of those is going to respond a little differently. Some will come in that we don't even have yet.
All right, right here in the middle.
For people that are trying to do 100% renewables for energy issues, usually end up with some kind of bio-based fuel that you'd use for winter conditions, wood, straw, or anything else you'd be growing that you can use. The issue is, how do we do that in a way that doesn't mess up biodiversity more than conventional agriculture does, which is already kind of a pain?
Well, I agree that's a difficult issue. Fortunately, it hasn't been seriously problematic yet in New England, as far as I'm aware, but with an increased focus on renewable energy, pushes to create new biomass energy plants, it is potentially an issue, and I know it's been looked at when in permitting biomass projects up in northern New Hampshire, and looking at the wood base, basically the supply of energy in the surrounding area that can support those. Right now, it's not a problem, but obviously it'd be something that people need to be vigilant about.
Yes, I'd like to ask what your take is on why we should care at all about biodiversity. I know David had set forth in his article this morning some of the bases why it's important, and I think E.O. Wilson wrote a book a long time ago, some of which I've forgotten, trying to explain that as well.
So there are a number of approaches, arguments in favor of conserving biodiversity. Before I came here, I was thinking that I would just tell everybody to go home and read a Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, and that would pretty much give you what you needed to know. But I conveniently printed out some Aldo Leopold quotes, and I will read the key quote. "The last word in ignorance is the man who says of an animal or a plant, 'What good is it?' If the land mechanism as a whole is good, then every part is good, whether we understand it or not. If the biota in the course of eons has built something like we like but do not understand, then who but a fool would discard seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering." And so basically, we're saying that from that argument, we don't know very much about how the natural world works. And if we value the natural world, removing parts of it because of carelessness or because of a desire to use it for something, that can cause repercussions that we can't predict and damage the natural environment in ways that we can't imagine. I'll let Pam have a couple other options here.
I'm going to stick with that option for a minute because there's a couple of really cool stories, one of which is more of a story, one of which is actually a published scientific paper about this sort of interconnectedness of all things and how messing with one piece can actually mess up something else. And you guys are asking us questions, but if you've ever had me give a talk, I ask the audience questions, and this is my turn to ask you a question. So think about it. We won't torture you for too long, but think about how overfishing in the North Pacific can cause beach erosion in California. Anybody want to guess? Beach erosion in California being an indirect result of overfishing in the North Pacific. So pieces are being removed and causing something we didn't expect to happen, which is exactly what Pete's quote was about. And we want to hazard any kind of guess. I won't torture you for too long. But you guys have to think as well. One guess, you get a free beer on me. Close, but not quite. Free soda. Sorry? Wales is part of it, so okay. No. No, I didn't say beers. So the story goes something like this, is that back in the 60s when it was still whaling in the North Pacific, whale populations went way down. Killer whales, which eat big whales, had to eat something else. And they ate the seals up, the seals declined. They started eating sea otters declined. Sea otters eat sea urchins. Sea urchins increased because there weren't as many sea otters. Sea urchins eat kelp. The kelp declined because there was too many urchins eating it, and kelp provides these really dense forests, essentially underwater in the Pacific Ocean, that actually buffer wave action and absorb carbon. And so as the kelp declined, wave action increased, which actually could potentially wash your house from Point Big Sur into the Pacific Ocean. It hasn't been documented directly, but all those pieces of that story are there. And it may actually exacerbate climate change because the kelp forests are also carbon storage things. So there's one example about how unforeseen things, like there's 5 or 6 steps in that story that tell that story.
A similar one that's been in the news somewhat lately is reintroducing wolves into Yellowstone. They're saying because they came, the wolves started hunting the elk changed their browsing patterns, they stopped eating shrubs along the riverbanks because on the riverbank you're more exposed to the predator, and so the vegetation was growing on the riverbanks that hadn't before, and so the actual shape of the rivers the smaller rivers, the creeks and streams in Yellowstone has changed because of the introduction of the wolves. I mean, the erosion patterns are changing, and so they're flowing in different parts of it. And I mean, you know, who would have predicted that? And the answer is, of course, nobody, not even computer modeling. So that's a good example of why it matters, even when it's hard to say exactly why it matters. So, all right. Oh, over here. Are you, okay.
I heard earlier where somebody is concerned about the database of things in New Hampshire. How many different creatures and things do we really have?
This is Science Cafe. We want numbers.
I can't speak to everything. For plants, we have, the New Hampshire flora has about 2,000 species of vascular plants. About 3/4 of those are native to the state. The rest are introduced. I don't know about all the different species of wildlife, but before I give it to Pam, there are countless numbers of things that we know very little about. And that includes from the plant side, mosses, if you consider them not animals anyway, lichens, fungi, the whole world of microbial life. I mean, we know very little about it, tens of thousands of species in all likelihood.
Yeah, I forgot to bring a nice pie chart with me. There are probably between 15 and 20,000 species of plants and animals in the state. And a couple of thousand of those are plants, 12 to 15,000 of those are insects. So insects are 3/4 of the critters in the state. And there's like 500 vertebrates and 500 other arthropods and stuff like that. So, you know, insects basically rule. And probably 1/4 of those are beetles.
Question over here.
Yeah, in regard to the forest and beetles, do you know where we're currently at with the eradication of the Asian longhorn beetle, the ash borer, I believe is the name of it?
Those are two different insects. The Asian longhorn beetle is not in New Hampshire that I'm aware of. There was a population in Worcester that was hopefully cleared out. The emerald ash borer is here. It started right here in Concord, probably a mile from this building, and is now, I think, in most of the southern counties. And the chances of eradicating that right now are really slim. There's work, I was at a talk a couple weeks ago. They're trying to bring in some, hybrid ash trees. They're also trying to bring in some predators of the ash borer, but if nothing else, we can basically keep it at low levels. It's not going anywhere. It's breeds too quick and disperses too fast. Our forests are going to change big time.
But that actually brings up an interesting point, because bringing in new species should, in theory, increase biodiversity, right? Yeah.
Well, when we talk about biodiversity, usually what we're talking about is the native biodiversity, the biodiversity that is evolved and adapted to the natural environments that we have here in the state. And there's, as I mentioned, there's probably about 500 or so non-native plants that have naturalized in New Hampshire and are reproducing, and you see them all over the place, weeds in the sides of roads and in your lawns and in stuff. And a small percentage of those are what we consider invasive. They breed prolifically, they invade natural habitats and can kind of displace native species, can disrupt food webs. And so introducing non-native things isn't necessarily the best idea for something like the EAB and biocontrol. It could potentially have benefits that far outweigh the risks, and they do evaluate the risks using what they call specificity studies to make sure they're not attacking native things. But there's always a chance that bringing in something that didn't naturally occur there can cause big problems.
I just going to say Why do we need black flies?
Black flies are incredibly unpleasant if you are a human being out when they are out, but they are indicators of, they breed in cold water streams and are indicators of good water quality, and the larvae that live in those streams serve as a valuable food source for a number of other aquatic organisms. And as much as we might like to get rid of them, if we lost them, it could have serious ramifications for a whole range of things that depend on them.
Well, my problem is that every time I'm with somebody else, they're around me.
I don't know
Not
what to
somebody
tell.
else.
You need to change your shampoo. I have a question over here.
Oh, speaking of other people's favorite insects, ticks. There's certainly been in the news a lot with the effect on the moose population and stuff like that, and all the various diseases. Is the tick population itself actually going up, or are they just becoming more aware of them and more concerned because of the diseases they carry?
We need to have Alan Eaton here from UNH, but tick populations go up and down just like any population does with cold winters, warm winters. So the winter ticks that are the moose problem, this was not a bad winter because it was cold enough a couple times that a lot of them didn't make it through compared to last winter. So tick populations do this all the time.
All right, well, join me in thanking our panelists for donating their time. And once again, next month's topic is citizen science, what it is, why it is, and what projects are out there that you can participate in. If you want the email newsletter, it's the pad in the back of the room. Write your name down. Otherwise, that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, guys.